Hello, everyone. So I'm here with the one and only Robin Collins. There are no others anywhere in the world. Um, the backstory is Richard Carrier wrote. So I have a long piece about fine tuning. Richard Carrier, who's an atheist mythicist blogger, wrote a reply to me on fine tuning. And so I'm planning on writing a reply at some point, but sort of in the interim, I thought it would be worth having an actual expert on to evaluate the claims about fine tuning. Robin Collins is one of the foremost experts in the world on fine tuning, so I thought it would be worth sort of going through the claims in the video and seeing to what extent they hold up, or more precisely, to what extent they really don't hold up. But so, Robin, thanks for doing this. And do you want to say a bit about yourself?
All right, thank you. Okay, do you want to start with the first claims, or did you want to discuss?
Yeah, so we can. Okay, so let's.
I could make some preliminary comments if you want.
Yeah. Feel free to make some preliminary comments.
So, just a couple things about the way it's written. First of all, it's name calling. It's argument ad hominem, which is widely recognized. If you took a basic logic course, it's one of the major fallacies, name calling, and it usually indicates you don't really know what you're talking about, so you have to call people names. So first of all, the whole way he proceeds is very fallacious.
Yeah, I mean, right. The whole thing is just dripping with this sort of smug invective, where just constantly insulting people who know way more about fine tuning than Richard Carrier. Like, he calls Luke Barnes a crank, I think. Yeah, he says Luke Barnes is a
delusional.
Yeah. I mean, it's just peppered with it. Like, yeah.
It sounds like he's playing to his audience, which says something about his audience, that they're, they don't want to really analyze the view. They just want to revel in calling people names and being a kind of pseudo objections to the arguments that you feel kind of good about, that they're in the morally and epistemically superior position.
Yeah.
So normally I wouldn't even respond to this kind of thing, because it violates such rules of productive and civil discourse that's aimed at truth. So first of all, just tells me it's not aimed at truth; it's aimed at something else. Trying to get it's for the audience, reinforce a sort of tribalism among them, that they're the kind of superior ones. So anyhow, that's my first comment. My second comment is, it's like there's tons of objections here. It's a well-known debater trick, is you throw 50 objections at somebody, and of course most of them are superficial objections, and the person only has time to deal with a few of the objections. And so then you come back and say, well, you didn't address this, that, and the other objection. Well, obviously you couldn't have. So the way to frame this is, we'll look at a few of the important objections, such as I often hear, and then see why they are superficial once you dig down. They have an initial appeal to them, and I won't deny some of the objections do. But in philosophy and other areas, to get at what the true situation is, you have to dig down and go deeper on the objection. So that's what I would intend to do, like 2 or 3 of the major objections.
Yeah, I mean, like the post, I mean, just look at just look at, so it says a common, like, it's just tons and tons of links. And so to get to the bottom of it, he just links to basically everything he's ever written about fine tuning. And so you're just sort of confronted with this wall of many, many different arguments. And so it's impossible to address them all. Okay, but so I guess, so maybe we can sort of start from the top.
Well, I want to just point out, so, and even just philosophy as a whole, well, philosophy, particularly analytics philosophy, is, its main aim is to present good arguments and carefully evaluate arguments. So the rhetorical move here is basically say, I don't have to deal with professional philosophers. I could just throw out a bunch of junk because I've just dismissed them right away. And it just shows a complete ignorance of what they're doing, because their whole analytic philosophy in particular, it's the whole thing is about careful arguments.
Yeah. So maybe we can get into his first claim where he says the argument, I mean, of course, dripping with his sort of standard sneering by pretending. Okay, but putting aside all the sort of pointless rhetorical flourishes, his first objection seems to be that fine tuning just kicks the improbability back a level, where the idea is that if fine tuning is super improbable, because then why wouldn't God need to be finely tuned? Aren't the odds of God arising by chance? Isn't that similarly improbable? So this is an objection that you and I have both addressed in various places. But I guess what's your basic take on this objection?
Well, I want to first just point out there's a kind of contradiction here, because later he says on these kind of claims we have no basis for assessing probability, but then he goes on and says the naturalistic hypothesis is less lucky or more probable than the theistic hypothesis. Well, you can't have it both ways. If you can't assess probabilities in this context because you don't have relative frequencies, then you can't say that either. They're just become inscrutable.
But, yeah, it's interesting. So Carrier, like, at various points, he'll sound like a Bayesian, but then when he's getting his priors, then he'll sound like a frequentist, where he'll think you can only get priors from reference classes. Right. So when he is when he says, "Oh, the fine tuning, it's totally inscrutable," when the probability is of fine tuning, it's totally inscrutable. We don't know what the odds are with fine tuning. But then when he's pulling numbers basically out of thin air, and out of thin air, there's a slightly less polite phrase I could have used for where one might pull numbers out of. In his book about where he argues for Jesus mythicism, where basically like the odds are just coming from who knows where.
Right.
Yeah, it's weird.
So you can't have
when there's a
both
natural
ways.
Parameterization, our probability is completely inscrutable in Richard Carrier land.
Which is the case in which they're most objective in that case, when you don't have a relative frequency. But I ultimately think relative frequencies don't really presuppose something deeper. Well, let me get in this first one. And I just say in the literature out there, which he doesn't seem to here at least address, of course, Richard Swinburne has famously argued that the God hypothesis is the simplest explanation, and it's widely used in science that an explanation that's more simple is a priori. That means before you look at the substantial look at the evidence, more probable. So you favor simple explanation. So the God hypothesis, he claims, is the most simple because it hypothesizes a being that has unlimited knowledge and power and perfectly free. So you don't have to build in any complexity, or at least only a minimal amount, into that being. Now, I elaborate on that a little more in one of the arguments, and there's a section out of I've addressed this in most of my writing in one way or another, because I think this is an objection that really needs to be answered. Is the major objection that people like Dawkins use, and perhaps the only real objection to design arguments, is that it requires more design, more what they call specified complexity. God does than the universe, and the big like J.J.C. Smart and Hume said the same. Goes back to Hume. But J.J.C. Smart put it this way: the designer of an artifact must be at least as complex as the artifact itself. That would be the kind of general principle. And Hume says the order in God's mind would have to be as complex or as ordered, or more so than that of the world, so you don't have any gain in appealing to God. Now, I'm not clear that principle always holds in the designer of an artifact. I mean, I can imagine us building a computer system that's more complex than the brain. But apart from that objection, a more direct way of answering it is going down to what their fundamental intuition is. And I would agree with this fundamental intuition is that the blueprint for an artifact has to be at least as complex as the artifact itself. That makes a lot of sense. So it has to be as structured as the artifact itself. So when then the idea is if you spell it out more precisely, which I've never seen them do, they just kind of leave it with that and move on. But if you spelled it out more precisely, that would mean the blueprints in God's mind would have to be as structured, put together as the universe itself. Well, here there's a two-step argument to get around. So there's blueprints in God's mind. Then we'll talk about the simplicity of God's agency in God's self. So the blueprints of God's mind are what philosophers would call possible worlds. And both theists and atheists, many atheist philosophers subscribe to possible worlds. And most theists do, actually, in analytic philosophy. And they're just representations of the way things could have been. And the motivations for them is to be able to make sense of our talk about modality, possibility, and necessity. That's one of the major motivations for this. So it's held across the board, almost by all, that possible worlds exist necessarily. That means those representational structures don't require a further explanation. Anything that exists necessarily is self-explanatory because it's absolutely impossible to otherwise. So possible worlds have this necessary existence in the same way as mathematical Platonists think abstract mathematics. Mathematical objects have necessary existence. And by the way, it's really hard to get around mathematical Platonism. It's widely held both by theists and atheists because math seems like one reason is math seems like it's discovered, not just simply invented. So that's a whole separate set of arguments. So once you have that, then you have two ways the theists could go here. They could either think, as the whole medieval tradition thought, that mathematical or possible worlds were representations in God's mind, what they call the divine ideas. In that case, all the structure captured by possible worlds, because each of them is like a blueprint, captures the structure of the world. They exist necessarily, so are self-explanatory. Now, Swinburne doesn't go this far with the analysis, but I go this far with the analysis. I think it's the blueprint that is really the issue. And the other view is that they just exist on their own, sort of Platonic realm. And then you would still get the same result because God, being omniscient, would know them. And therefore, God's mind would have this indirectly have this structure as a result of perceiving the possible worlds. So you've got the blueprint itself, and then what God's role is to decide not to create the structure out of nowhere. God's not doing that. God's just deciding what blueprint to actualize. So that's really where the fine tuning comes down to, is why a blueprint that's life permitting when there seems to be blueprints, vastly more blueprints, if there's real fine tuning, that aren't life permitting. And so then you need to give an account of why God would choose a life permitting universe. And there, I think I use what Swinburne does, is an idea going back to Plato and also found in like Neo-Confucian philosophers, is that the good, when you perceive something as being good, that automatically gives you a reason for believing. And some people call that the good is self-motivating, the good is desirable. So God, being perfectly free, if you did Swinburne's framework, has no contrary other motives. God perceives that some worlds realize values more than other worlds. And so the value realization of the world gives God a motive to bring it about, which is then an explanation of why there's a fine-tuned universe, because it realizes certain values based on embodied conscious agents than other universes. So it takes away the coincidence of there being such universe without making it lucky, the luck rising there. There's no coincidence either of this blueprint existing in God's mind, because of necessity, all possible blueprints exist. And second, it's not highly unlikely that God would decide to create such a world because it exhibits a kind of value and of goodness. And it's not lucky that God desires good things, because that just comes out of the nature of the good and God being perfectly free. So that's how the deep structure of the argument goes. Then you'd
Yeah.
have to address the question of why would there be a being? Is it lucky for there to be a being like God? And there, I think I have two methods of addressing that. One is if you think of something has to be fundamental, either consciousness has to be fundamental or the unconscious. And so you have a choice or some combination of the two. Then you go with consciousness. Doesn't seem that unlikely. It's just there's three possibilities here. Let's go with consciousness. And then consciousness goes along with will. And then the simplest or the one that has the least amount of additional stuff, facts you have to hypothesize, is if consciousness is really fundamental, then it's not bounded. It's fundamental. It's not bounded by anything exterior. So then it becomes, by its very nature, um, unrestricted consciousness, and the will is not, which goes with consciousness, is not bound. So you get omniscience and omnipotence. And I think that's all you kind of actually really need. So that's one way of going. The other way of going is saying, well, we can't show that God exists, but we can show that the idea of God is more plausible than just thinking this fine tuning occurred for no reason. And the way you do that is a lot of people think it's plausible. You can't prove it, but that you need a mind to ground Platonic truths. That they find it really odd that mathematical truths, which you seem to need even to be able to discover mathematics and explain why mathematics works so well in the world, those truths exist on their own. Like, you discover, mathematicians discovered there's in the number system, there's no largest prime number. It's not something they just invented. The number system entails that, and that entailing of that, the Peano axioms, is something that exists necessarily. And once you think that, then you think, well, and then all that could be reduced to set theory, and sets are sets are defined by conglomeration or grouping things together, and so it makes sense that those sets would be God's grouping of various objects. So you could then kind of ground. At least it's plausible to think it needs a grounding. Some people want to go still with just a Platonic realm for it, but at least it's plausible. So if it's plausible that it's grounded in God, and then if it is grounded in God, since possible worlds exist necessarily, then God would have to exist in order for them to exist. And so it follows that God exists necessarily, and hence God's existence is not in need of explanation. And therefore, it's at least plausible to think God is self-explanatory, and hence it's not lucky that God exists. Where, on the other hand, it's very lucky not only the fine-tuning, but that the laws of nature, which is often neglected, but like regularists think the laws are just, and the typical position in philosophy is that the laws are just no deeper reason why things continue behaving in the same way, like why masses always attract each other, which seems to be just a huge cosmic coincidence. So my argument is at least more plausible than that. So getting all back to this, this is a superficial objection. It has some initial merit, but if you really want to figure out if the fine-tuning argument has merit, you have to dig deeper. And that's clearly not something Carrier does. It's just like, okay, this is an objection going back to Hume. So it's a serious philosophical objection, but he hasn't really dug deeper into, as far as I can tell, into potential answers to that objection. So in my view, it's much less lucky for God to exist than the enormous luck you would have to have for the fine-tuning and the laws of nature.
Yeah, I very much agree. I think like basically the sort of the TLDR is that God's essential property is something very simple. So God is at core something like boundless consciousness or a boundless mind or something like that. And then once you have something that's unbounded and that you have a sort of simple property instantiated without limit, that's no longer arbitrary. So it's not like you have some parameter that has to be set to a super precise value. You have you just have a simple property set to infinity, and then that's not unbounded. That's not arbitrary. Like if no one would be convinced by a fine-tuning argument from parameters that were set to infinity, because infinity is distinctly non-arbitrary.
Right.
I agree,
or zero.
I agree with the second half of what you said as well. There was a while when I was skeptical of the second half of what you said, because I still lean towards the view that light probably. I'm a Platonist, so I think probably the better explanation of abstract objects is not in a mind, but that they sort of float free. But I think so long as you think that the theistic conceptualism is at least like not massively implausible, that its odds aren't 1 in a trillion or whatever, then if this kind of theistic conceptualism, if it's a sort of a distinct option, then it has a non-trivial prior probability before you think about fine-tuning. And so then you'll think that this is already a live option on the table, that theism, it starts with an okay prior, and then it just gets a huge boost from fine-tuning, and so it's overall plausible. It'd be sort of like, even if you didn't think nominalism was right, if somehow you learned that nominalism explained fine-tuning, then it would start making sense. Think, okay, that's actually a good argument for nominalism.
Right, that's right.
Yeah. So I guess, so that's so I broadly agree with that.
And
okay.
you need to bring in the blueprints thing, because I think that's the core behind their intuitions. So that with God's omniscience, if it's an essential property, then comes all possible blueprints being in God's mind. And those provide the structure. And what's the improbability comes is not that those possible structures exist, because even if you're an atheist, you think they all exist. So the whole specified complexity way of framing it is incorrectly about order. It's that this particular order exists that has this feature that is of great interest, or it strikes us as very significant. That's what the issue is. So
right.
Also, the specified complexity is a bad way of even framing it.
Yeah. By the way, so the article Carrier links to in the where he talks about some specified complexity.
Right.
I did read that article a while ago, and the article assumed that you needed to store information in a physical brain. Then said, so God would need an infinitely complicated brain. But obviously theists are not going to say that God has a physical brain. That
begs the question.
Right. So theists tend to be dualists, and the ones that are physicalists, they tend to at least be dualists about God, where they say that God has a non-physical mind. And so then if God has a non-physical mind, you don't need anything physical to support it. Now, Carrier's objection to that is he says all the minds we know of are physical. But first of all, that isn't correct, in that just begs the question against dualism. And second of all, even if all the minds that we knew of were physical, we only know the minds of one species. Well, maybe of non-human animals as well, but of one very distinct kind of life. So it's also true that all the minds we know of are it's true that all of the structures that give rise to minds that we know of are between the size of a cell and a tree. But that doesn't mean that all possible brains are that size. It just means
Well, it
that that's
sounds like
the ones we know.
he's given a decisive argument against any kind of extraterrestrial intelligence because all life, all all minds we know of are here on Earth. Very good argument.
Yeah, well,
So get
actually,
rid of all that SETI project.
yeah. Now, actually, well, that it used to be a good argument, but then humans went to the moon, and so after that, our credence in
Okay, well they're
extraterrestrial.
within the
Yeah.
frame of Earth. Yeah.
They're all from Earth
Obviously,
originally.
obviously any kind of inductive generalization, you already have to have what's relevant. So
Yeah.
that begs the question of whether it's relevantly necessary for there to be a brain for a mind. It doesn't really settle that issue at all. Um,
Yeah.
so
He also seems, well, I don't know. There are too many links. We can't go through all of them. But I mean, if you just dig into any one of them, they're all bad arguments. Okay, so second, it has no data by which to establish any of its premises. We don't know what can be fine-tuned or what selects the variables that there are, or what probability distribution that creation selection process has. I mean, normally, if you're unsure about the selection process, that won't have, then you'll just apply a kind of indifference principle over it,
right,
right?
that's
So,
right.
right, we're not sure what the selection process is for the original initial conditions of the universe. But if it's spelled out made by God with love in every human language, we wouldn't say, well, we don't know the selection process, so it's no evidence
Right.
either way.
Right. Well, we don't. It's not even knowing this selection. That's going kind of back to a relative frequency of physicalist conception of probability, which begs the question here, because they're not using they're using epistemic probability, which is what's the rational degree of or logical probability of it being in this range instead of some other very wide range. So it's not even relevant here unless you're presupposing a relative frequency or theoretical conception or physicalist conception where some physical process has to generate the outcome, and then you look over what's the probability of various outcomes in that. And then what can be fine-tuned? Well, like you said, the issue is why is it fall into this small range instead of all these other conceptual possibilities? So it's not about physical possibilities because there is no physical possibility if you have a single universe. This is all there is. There's no physical possibility. They are just what they are. But there's a conceptual possibility, and that's where you're putting, you're imagining different scenarios. So it also shows really a lack of digging down into the issue. And let me give a couple of illustrations here. A whole branch of physics called statistical mechanics, it puts probability distributions over the, let's say, position and velocities of particles and gives them an equal probability distribution. It's called phase spaces. This is central to a major pillar of physics. And there's only one distribution in the universe of particles in terms of their position and velocity, but you put the probability distribution over all these possibilities that don't exist, only exist conceptually, and then that's how you derive all probabilities except quantum probabilities are derived from that assumption. That's what underlies all physical probabilities.
Yeah.
Is this kind of probability. And you can give other cases where probability judgments were made apart from for confirmation of theories. And I list some of those. I could just say one of those is how is atomic theory confirmed? There was an Energist school at the turn of around 1900, and that didn't believe there was atoms. And according to Wesley Salmon, who studied all this, his book on explanation, what convinced people was that all these different independent methods of determining Avogadro's number all gave right near the same result. But they reasoned if this atomic theory were false, then that would be enormously coincidental, but not if atomic theory were true. So none of what he says here would apply. There was nothing that selected that atomic theory be true, nothing that selected that all these methods would yield the same thing. It was a judgment over possibility space. And you
Yeah.
can give many examples from science there. And so if you really followed his advice, a huge bunch of our theories would just be killed. So he hasn't even thought very carefully about this issue of probability.
Yeah,
And
I
so
think
that gets into
basically,
the next objection.
yeah, and the core idea is just everything that he's saying here, he could say just as much if the initial condition spelled out made by God. And so if that
Right.
argument wouldn't work there, it doesn't work here. Or like another example you've given that I like is with continental drift. If you look
Right.
at the evidence for continental drift, it comes from things that are very surprising if there's no continental drift and very expected if there is. So, for example, the continental shelves line up like jigsaw pieces,
Right.
or that you had similar fauna on Africa and South America up
Plants
until
and
some
animal
point
life. Yeah,
where
that's right.
they sharply diverged. And then that would be make sense if you have, but that makes sense if there is continental drift and is unexpected otherwise. But that's not an objective probability. It's not like we've had thousands of planets on which continental
Right.
drift occurs and thousands on which it doesn't occur. And there's 900 times likelier if it occurs than if it doesn't. But it's some very unexpected observation if continental drift does not occur. Okay,
And that's
so
what evolutionary theory is based on. That you don't. It's like you can't rerun the tape and have
right.
frequencies, but it's the so many independent lines of evidence seem to point to that. It seems very unlikely if the thesis of common ancestry is not true, as one author stated. So there's so many cases of this that you don't use relative frequencies. And as I show in another piece, relative frequency itself even depends on another kind of probability.
Right. Okay. So his next objection is the frequency of life-bearing universes, and that possibility space is unknown. It's he
You've
says,
already kind of answered that.
yeah, but then he seems to branch off to the measure problem, which seems like he's making two different issues. But okay, so he raises the measure problem, where the idea of the measure problem is that he seems to be saying that because there's an infinite range of values the constants could take on, then you can't assign probabilities across it because you can't assign probabilities across an infinite range. So this is kind of a well-known problem. You've addressed it before, but for those who haven't yet heard your response, like what do you say about this kind of reply?
So what is it? The infinite number of if they're infinitely adjustable constants?
Yeah, I think his
But
claim is that the constants could take on any of an infinite number of values. And so then it doesn't
right,
make sense to say that the probability of them falling in any range is low. It's sort of like what the McGrews have argued with the measure problem.
right. Okay, so there's a couple responses to it. One is that that's not necessarily true for a lot of constants. It's like we do have, because we're really making probability judgments within a model. And that's what Ian Hacking, he's written a lot of the probability, stresses that probability judgments are really made within a model of how things work. And in that case, our models don't really tell us, like in the case of the cosmological constant, they're restricted to this, about 0 to 100, 10 to the 120th power, taller, larger than it is. And then after that, it violates a Planck scale constraint. And then you'd have to have a quantum gravity to evaluate what happens. Now, what I do in my long paper on this, I talk about the epistemically illuminated range, and I give a kind of simple example of that, where you have a dartboard. You don't know how far the dartboard extends. You can't see it, you're in the dark, but you have a spot. It could extend infinitely as far as you know. So you have a spotlight, and it's over like a meter spotlight, and then there's a bullseye of 1 millimeter in the center. and a dart comes along and hits the bullseye. So the question is whether the dart was randomly thrown or not, or whether somebody threw it and aimed at the bullseye, or some machine just randomly threw it. I think the pretty obvious answer is that it strongly confirms that somebody aimed it, even though there's an infinite space for where the dart could have hit at. There might be even an infinite number of bullseyes, as far as you know. So you restrict the probability space to what you can determine. So I call that the epistemically illuminated region. It's the region for which you can determine whether a value of a constant or parameter is life permitting. And so at least the outer edge of what you could determine in the case of, let's say, the cosmological constant, which is thought now to be correspond to the dark energy density of space. The outer limit of that is 10 to the 120th power larger, because then our current models break down, so we don't even know what the effect would be.
Right.
So that's the proper way of doing this. And you could see quite clearly by that dartboard example that you always restrict it to the range you can see, of.
Yeah, another point is that if you look at the way that the fine-tuning argument tends to go, it has a lot to do. So and this is a point that Aaron Walls made to me. It has a lot to do, not very often, not with absolute values of constants. So it's not like this constant has to take on this amount, but instead it has to do with like the ranges between different constants. So with the cosmological constant, it has to do with the interaction between a bunch of different values. And so it's like you have these values that in total are 10 to the 100, that in total you add them together, and some are positive and some are negative, and the value left over is 1 in 10 to the 120th times as great as their value. So it would be like if you took Bill Gates's annual income and then you subtracted 1% of the GDP of Micronesia, and then you had 4 cents left over. It's like that would be a really big coincidence. And so you don't have to you don't have to take a parameterization over like what the odds are of Bill Gates having different amounts of money. You can just say, given the amounts of money that Bill Gates has and how much money is in the economy of Micronesia, it's very unlikely that they almost exactly cancel out.
Yeah, that's the physicist's intuition behind it. So you could do it either way. And that's because quantum field theory generates huge numbers for the cosmological constant. And then you have to have something else that counteracts that. Now, you might say that's just a flaw with quantum field theory. The problem is inflationary cosmology requires a huge dark energy density, and so does the standard model in its Higgs field. So it's really hard to say it's just a problem in physics, because the problem keeps coming up from all kinds of different angles. So that's where he tries to say something about that later, just a simple problem of physics. And I guess he gets that from Victor Stengner, but it isn't. It's because it's not just simply, once we figure out there's this problem and figure out how to get the quantum field theory, the vacuum fluctuations, to not be huge, we've solved the problem, and we haven't. And further, you can't just do it that way either, because then if they just went to zero, like in the case of the cosmological constant, if it was zero, you could just invoke a symmetry principle or something, that required them be zero to be something, a contrary, a negative contribution that canceled it out. And it wouldn't be surprising then if it was zero, but it's when it's that we know it's positive now, and that gives you the huge surprise.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess the next thing he says is, and then a last thing, and this is a point that you made, I think, in your Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology article, is that it's weird to reject fine tuning because of the measure problem. Like, imagine, like, if anything, the parameter as the bounds being infinite seems to make the problem worse. Where it's like, if it has to fall in this range, if it has to fall here, and then the possible values are here, that's pretty impressive. But if the possible values are infinite, well, that should be strictly worse. That makes fine tuning
Right.
strictly less likely, right? So I don't think this is a good objection
And
to fine
I
tuning.
give ordinary cases of that with a measure problem, like, you have God through the angel, and you believe the angel that there's a golden planet was created and the universe is infinite. Now, and in some solar system, you'd be foolish to try to look for it in our solar system because you should judge the probability of that as zero, even though it's not normalizable. So if anybody's familiar with that whole set of arguments.
Yeah.
So this shows again that, Carrier hasn't even looked very deeply in it. He maybe should, cite somebody who's argued against it, but hasn't really looked at the argument back and forth, as
Yeah,
though
it
this
kind of
person who
reminds
cites it
me
gives.
of like when I did high school debate, where like you'd want to sort of like when you were making a point, that where you were disagreeing with someone, you'd want to sort of vaguely gesture in the direction of some idea so it can look
Mhm.
like you made where
Right,
you sort of like you just read what the people on your side prove, and then you would have say, and then you have like one person who references some fact, but
right.
you don't understand the fact very well, and you don't address the real objections. Okay, right. So, and I mean, it's just this vast deluge of links where it's like,
I
okay,
know.
how like it, I mean, what is the purpose of all these links if not to just drown the reader in links where they
Right.
say,
That
oh, there's just
he
all
must
this.
really know. He must
Yeah,
really know his stuff.
yeah,
It's
and
smoke
basically all
screening.
the links are to old Richard Carrier blog posts. Now,
Right.
um, I'll just, I mean, not all of them, but more than half. Now I'll just say it would be surprising if the 90 most useful things to be said about fine tuning were all blog posts from the same guy
Right.
who has no background in physics. But okay, so moving on. So he says hardly any theoretical physicist finds it convincing. It's simply not a scientific theory. It shows up in no peer-reviewed scientific study. But I think that's I mean, I think so. I think it is true, and Phil Halper has polls on this, that physicists tend not to buy the fine-tuning argument. But I think the fine-tuning argument is really a philosophical argument that draws on explanations from physics. And physicists don't have any special expertise in philosophy of physics. And among
And they
philosophers,
also,
even atheist ones, they tend to take the argument from fine-tuning pretty seriously.
the physicist, when he says he seems to link that as simply not a scientific theory. Well, I agree with you because I think scientific theories have to be. Um, I'm a kind of methodological naturalist on these sorts of things, not a methodological atheist. There's a distinction between the two. A methodological naturalist, which science should only invoke natural entities, but um, it doesn't mean it's not a metaphysical theory, and doesn't mean it's not the best explanation, because scientific theories are not the only kind of theories that can be confirmed or have, positive epistemic status, if you will. So
Right. Right.
that's
It
just a
would be like saying, oh,
non-starter.
belief in Julius Caesar, that's not a scientific theory. Well, no, it's a historical theory.
Right.
Belief that we're not brains and vats, that's not a scientific theory. That's a philosophical theory, but it's still justified. Okay, moving on. I mean, there's just so much. Okay, blah blah blah. Okay, the fine-tuning argument has apparently already been refuted. Let's see. Should we address this? Oh, I mean, this is just a kind of old issue of the universe is mostly inhospitable to life. Maybe you could say something about that. I've written a kind of long post. Maybe I'll link the post I've written about this in the comments. But I don't know. Do you want to say something about that?
Well, I mean, ultimately, I think so. I'll give a couple of things. I would say I don't think it's a very weak objection unless you think God would have a good reason to create a universe in which most of it was all full of life. And from a Bayesian perspective, then it would lower the probability of what we find on the existence of God if you have a good reason for that. But first of all, I don't see a good reason for it because um, the God's not. It's like God's not the great engineer that cares about efficiency because God has infinite resources. So you wouldn't want to, waste a universe, a bunch of it being lifeless if you had fewer resources. But the second thing is in the last, as you know, in the last 15 years, I pursued this idea of fine tuning for scientific discovery. And you need a large universe to have discovery. You need to look at other galaxies, um, so on and so forth. So if you start bringing a universe that's fine-tuned for scientific discovery, of interest, all that sort of thing, as being of value, then God would have right there a reason to create a large universe. And also a large universe, if you believe in a kind of God that is, it's an infinite God who's eternal, then the large universe expresses the nature of God better, that very old. So it's like somebody wanted to express themselves in their creation would have attributes that would be comport with who they are. So the vastness of the universe gives us a sense of awe, and actually that kind of is a religious sense that leads people to God. So there's a lot of
Yeah,
reasons you could come up with for why God would create a large universe. And I don't see
yeah,
good reasons, no reasons offered here for why God wouldn't.
yeah, I agree. And so and also in terms of the universe being mostly inhospitable, right? So that just seems like a generalization of the problem of evil, where it's just like, why is it that we die when we go out into space? Well, I don't know, but presumably the explanation for all the world's other evils will cover that too. Now, regarding the given that God has no resource constraints, it's not clear why God would make it so that the universe is entirely teeming with life, especially because God's omnipotent. So the reason why, if you were making a creation, you would want to make more life is because it in some like limited system is that would be a good way to produce more life long term. But God can create as much life as he wants, no matter how densely it's distributed. And so he has no reason to care about, it doesn't matter if there's life on every galaxy. And if there was life that was too close, if he had all the life that he created be really close together, so there were just aliens on every planet, well, then there would be a risk of like them colonizing and destroying each other.
Right. No, there's all kinds of unintended consequences. So we could say,
right.
well,
And
create life that's not intelligent, but then the whole question, well, why didn't he stuff it with intelligent life? It just is I just find this objection so weak. It's hardly worth even taking seriously.
Yeah, and I think it's especially weak. Maybe this will give you like a small Bayes factor. I actually think overall, when you take into account facts about the scale of the universe, including that the universe is plausibly infinite, I think overall this will favor theism, because on theism you'd expect an infinite God to do infinite creating. But in any case, the Bayes factor seems very small. It seems very, very small compared to fine tuning. Okay, so he says, and this is a common error he makes. He says, without God, life can only exist by chemical accident, and such an accident would be rare. But he's conflating how you would get life, even if the way you get life is the way you'd expect to get life on atheism. As long as the probability of you getting life on atheism is very low, it's still evidence against it, right? So, so even if let's imagine there's a possible leprechaun named Steve who likes to cause magic that gets people 10 royal flushes in a row. Now, the way you get 10 royal flush, if you get 10 royal flushes, your arrangement of cards would be consistent with the way that Steve would likely do it. But because it's so unlikely that there is such a creature, it's very low probability. Similarly, even if this is the way you would expect life to be given naturalism, so long as life is very unlikely given naturalism, it's super unlikely that then life like this is evidence for theism. And in particular, Carrier just never justifies why you would expect life to arise this way on naturalism. If all you knew is that there was a naturalistic universe, you wouldn't expect there to be any consciousness, any physical systems that could produce consciousness. But even if you did, there's no reason to expect like biological systems in particular to be conscious. Panpsychism would be quite a bit simpler.
And also, the further thing to note here is that actually on atheism, you wouldn't expect it to arise as it did, because via evolution, you have to have exceedingly low entropy. And so basically, and that's far, far less probable than the life just spontaneously out of some fluctuation coming into existence. So under atheism, you actually predict that we're Boltzmann brains, just kind of intelligent fluctuations that are surrounded by chaos. You wouldn't expect it to happen by the evolutionary process when you look at the bigger picture, because evolution requires a relatively low entropy, which is very, very improbable. So actually, the reasoning is just completely in reverse. You don't expect that.
Yeah, totally agree. Okay, so so we've covered all that. Okay, enter Bentham's Bulldog. So here, I found this section surprising because he seemed to say nice things about me. He said I write well and stuff. I didn't know Carrier did that. I thought all he did was call people names. But okay. But,
well, he's good looking, but his arguments are terrible. Right? Start with a little bit of praise, which is quite irrelevant. I see you've frozen. You've frozen on me. Sorry, Matt, you've frozen on me.
hey, sorry about that. I lost internet, but I'm back.
Okay, good. So you were showing me about. I just noticed when I read the piece while you were gone, that little section. He doesn't give any. He says you make all these logical errors and stuff without one example.
Yeah.
I mean,
right.
at least if he made all these logical errors, couldn't you at least find one example of it?
Yeah, no, I mean it's very silly. I also like when he describes me as possibly being a teenager. Like, yeah, well, I'm not. I'm recent as of recently. I'm not a teenager, but like I think this does show just the minimal
very smart. You're a very smart teenager, unusually smart teenager. So even if you were, it's not.
Well, thank you.
Relevant.
Yeah, I have not been a teenager for a bit over a year. Well, like a year and a half, I guess. But it is just funny. It does show sort of like the low level fact checking where like this is a thing that's really easy to investigate, like figuring out, okay. But putting aside that, which isn't very substantive, okay. I will note,
I could have written what Carrier wrote just by plugging in the ChatGPT and said, write a vacuous, superficial argument against the fine tuning with a lot of insults in it, and out would have come his article.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Continuing. So, all right. Here, Adelstein generally does. So, regarding my first criticism, is I say that the idea that there's no fine tuning is wrong. That there's been a broad consensus among physicists of fine tuning. And he says, I don't know what I'm talking about. Okay. So he says, when describe. So I'll just read this paragraph For example, when describing the fine-tuning argument, he still thinks the cosmological constant was tuned to a specificity of 1 part in 10 to the 120th. This is so wrong, it's hard to decide where to begin. He has mistaken the cosmological constant with a completely different thing, a measured incongruity between quantum theory and observation that demonstrates there's something wrong about the theory. It does not have anything to do with which values are life producing. That is a measure of theory error. The actual constant is near zero, can vary by quite a lot, and still produce viable universes. In fact, not an optimal setting for life. It's just within the range for permitting life. Well, right, the optimal for life thing, that's a point we've already responded to. Moreover, outside values for this variable could lead to resets that tame the value through big crunches or Penrose states or inevitable Carroll-Chen states or Higao-Kai states or chaotic inflation or the like. Now, my sense is Carrier doesn't really know what these things are. Right. I emailed a physicist about it, and what he was saying was basically these are like very speculative models in quantum gravity that are generally not taken very seriously.
And they also
right, they're all just versions of the multiverse hypothesis.
Right.
Yeah,
and
but I guess right.
The quantum theory way of looking at it is the quantum theory sets the range of possible values of the cosmological constant, and so even if the quantum theory were wrong, and that there was something that tamed it or something else, it would still be a question of why does it tame it to be this really small value? Are you still there?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And then the second thing is, this is one that Weinberg, who was famously skeptical of all this stuff, surprising, he uses the cosmological constant. In the 90s, he said this is the one good case that really needed to be in, Steven Weinberg, the Nobel laureate, that really is a good case.
Well, I mean, Steven Weinberg, apparently he doesn't know what he's talking about. Only Richard Carrier does.
Yeah.
No, I mean, it's funny. It's like Carrier says that it's so wrong that you just, if you say the cosmological constant sees to be finely tuned, you don't know what you're talking about. And it's like there are Nobel Prize winning atheists who think that this is a big problem.
Well, in fact, commonly called the biggest problem in cosmology because it's not as easy as saying the quantum theory is wrong, because there's a lot of other things that reinforce it. So you kind of you have to say our entire cosmology is wrong. It's not just quantum theory being wrong. You have to throw the whole thing out.
Right.
It all could be wrong, and you could get it all could be wrong, and it's completely messed up. But that's a huge cost to say that.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, also he says that he points out the cosmological constant is near zero, but that's a little misleading because that doesn't make it not fine-tuned. Because the idea that the cosmological constant is affected by lots of different values, right? So it would be like in the case that I gave before, where you take Bill Gates's income and you subtract 1% of the GDP of Micronesia, and you have 9 cents left over, and then you say, well, and then I say this amount left over is finely tuned, and you say, well, actually, the value is near zero. Well, it is near zero, but it's near zero when you plug into together a bunch of different values that are vastly more than zero, and so the odds that they would together be very near zero are virtually low.
And even if you had some deeper theory that would account for entail this low value, then as Martin Rees, who is the Royal Astronomer Royal of Great Britain,
who also doesn't know what he's talking about, apparently.
Yeah, he's not quite as smart as Carrier, and Bernard Carr, cosmologist at I think it was Cambridge, I think.
Another dummy.
Wrote a famous article in 1979 saying, well, maybe a grand unified theory could explain these values. Then it would be very improbable, very fortuitous that theory led to just the right value. It would be like saying, maybe there's a grand unified theory. If I go up to the mountains and the rocks under a cliff spelled "Welcome to the mountains," Robin Collins. I think my brother's there, but Richard Carrier is beside me and says, no. Maybe there's a grand unified theory that entails that the rock just had, at this point in history, just that configuration that looks like this. Well, I would say, it'd be very, very improbable that that grand unified theory would be true instead of the huge number of others that would not predict that. So you just kick the probability back. You don't resolve it.
Yeah. I mean, for a lot of these claims, I can't quite tell what he's. So he says, I'm mistaken the cosmological constant with a completely different thing. Do you understand what he's talking about?
Well, this is a Victor Stegner's attempted criticism, is that all it is, if I remember right, is that it's really not a fine tuning. That's not the issue. It's that there's something wrong with quantum theory in that it predicts such a large vacuum energy. So there's this incongruity, and we know there isn't. So there's this incongruity between quantum theory and what we know about the vacuum energy. But the problem is, it's not just quantum theory. It's not just giving up quantum theory and modifying it. It's Higgs field. It's a whole basis of modern cosmology gets, thrown out. So maybe it's just, you could say it's just our modern cosmology is wrong, but that's a huge cost. And that's why it's still considered a major problem to be solved.
Yeah,
So
and it's funny.
that's what I think he tried to say.
He says I've confused it with a different thing, and he links to a Wikipedia page, and then the Wikipedia page in the sentence after the one he highlighted says, this issue is called the cosmological constant problem and is one of the greatest mysteries in science. But apparently Carrier doesn't think it's a mystery. Carrier just thinks
he solved it. He has solved it.
Right, and he has a grab bag of very speculative quantum cosmology papers that are generally not taken that seriously. But okay, so, I mean...
Let's do one more and then we can call it quits.
Okay, wait, so he says, in black hole cosmology, an inhospitable value is impossible. Do you know what he's talking about here?
He's probably talking about Smolin's theory of that, we're the result of black holes that give rise to blind holes, and so it's a kind of a selection effect. It's a kind of multiverse theory with a selection effect that kind of selects for our tiny universe. And so once again, it's a very speculative thing. So the general thing is you can always develop a speculative cosmology that gives the right thing. You can always do that anywhere. You can always come up with an ad hoc theory that will explain something. So I don't accept the Big Bang theory, so I go with Hoyle's theory, and as Narlikar did, who is a kind of follower of Fred Hoyle, the steady state theory, he keeps developing it with all these ad hoc assumptions to get the thing to work. But
yeah,
you can always do that.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, right. So it's like he says that it's not really a problem, and then he goes in for a bunch of like very speculative like multiverse proposals where we're not sure if they work. And the point is just that merely being able to come up with some alternative explanation by invoking a very specific kind of multiverse. Well, yeah, I mean, that doesn't solve the problem. And it doesn't mean that there's being able to come up with a multiverse theory to explain it. That doesn't mean it's not a problem. It just means you have an explanation of the problem. Now, as it happens later in the article, I talk about problems with the multiverse theory. I agree that the multiverse theory is the best response that an atheist has. And were I to be an atheist, that would be the response.
That's what I would do. I think that's the best response too.
But yeah, okay. So, so one other thing he says is, but the Pauli principle, he says and it's just all written with insane overconfidence, and it's this irritating combination of insane overconfidence and total ignorance. So he says there are other signs that Adelstein doesn't know what he's talking about here, like that he thinks the Pauli exclusion principle is indicative of fine tuning, but the Pauli principle is binary. It is either on or off. At random distribution, it would be 50-50. But the prior probability of any highly specific law is not 50%.
No,
right?
That's right.
Right. I mean, there aren't that many laws, right? So even if you think on average there will be, however many laws we have, depending on how you divvy them up, the prior probability of there being the Pauli principle in particular is low. And to be clear, it's not like I'm the one who suggested that the Pauli principle is a problem fine-tuning. This was in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article that was talking about instances in physics of fine-tuning. Now, you're right.
Well,
Carrier's right. I'm not a physicist, which is why I listen to the physicists, to what the majority of physicists say on the topic, rather than just sort of like taking a grab bag of sort of like random papers that suggest speculative proposals
right.
and then act like the issue has been settled when it really hasn't. I mean, it's just this very selective appeal to authority.
Yeah, so, I think the probability of a fair 6-sided die, or let's say 20-sided die, coming up on 2 is 50-50 because it either comes up on 2 or it doesn't.
Yeah.
I mean, it's as dumb as saying that, right? You can always reduce any claim to 2 possibilities. Either the claim is true or it's false. And if you did probabilities that way, you'd be in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, so I guess maybe
Did you want to do the multiverse?
We could do the multiverse. I mean,
or you've already felt. I mean, it's really not necessary to go through all of his because I think we've already shown he's way out of his depth. It's really superficial.
Yeah. Let's see. I don't know. Yeah, we could do the multiverse. One maybe we should get to that I think is especially annoying is we could do the Anthropic principle stuff, because here Carrier is really confident and he's just so wrong. It's kind of embarrassing to watch. Okay, so should we do that?
Yeah, we could do that, and then we can end it with that.
Okay, so he says the most important objection against the fine-tuning argument is this. So we would always observe ourselves in a finely tuned universe. So our observing that can't be assumed improbable on any theory because the probability of observing that is the same on all possible theories. Now, that's just a mistaken reasoning. The fact that you couldn't observe yourself unless X happened on any theory doesn't mean the odds of X happening are equal on every theory. It just means that the odds of X plus
that you observe yourself.
Yeah, right. Conditional on X and you observing yourself. Right. Okay.
Yeah. Then of course it means that because you built your existence into the background information, then of course it's going to be 1. But the question is, should you build your own? Usually, what you don't do that. You take the evidence and you subtract out the evidence or any background information that explicitly implies the evidence away, right? So you're assessing if you just include in the background information the evidence you're trying to judge a probability on, you always get 1. So it's not follow Bayesian reasoning. Now I know Sober tries to argue you should include it, but his argument has many problems. He could cite Sober and says, well, somebody's argued this, and then there's been objections to it. That would be fair enough if you cite that and say, people can get a work around this or have at least attempted to, but it's not obviously true. In fact, our natural inclination is against it. And that's where the famous, firing squad, right, is you're in a firing squad and you they say they're going to execute you and there's 50 sharpshooters and they all fire and you're still alive. Well, the natural thing to conclude is it was a fake execution. They didn't really mean to do it because it'd be so improbable that they wouldn't have hit you. And so but of course the probability that they wouldn't have hit you given you are existing is of course 1. So that's a common analogous situation. Now then Sober gives some kind of answer to that, and that's for Weisberg, Jonathan Weisberg, in an article of his, gives the example of
Wait, I
the
think it's,
pregnant
is it, I
mother.
thought it was Weinberg. Maybe I'm,
Well, I think I said it wrong last time. I think it's Weisberg.
okay.
Yeah, but you try both of them. So I think I said it wrong last time. Anyhow, so he gives a nice answer to Sober and says, well, if your pregnant mother, if like I give a variation of his, your pregnant mother was exposed to, let's say there was you worried that this house where your pregnant mother um, grew up in had this chemical that in it and lasts for a long time that was a 99.9999999 one in a trillion% um, chance of a pregnancy occurring given that chemical. And your pregnant mother was there, where you'd think your existence showed that there's nothing to worry about, right? Because if it was there, it would be very unlikely you would exist. And yet you're up if you get the same kind of situation here, that it's just an analogous situation. Your existence depends upon the chemical not being there. So there's an observer dependence here. But all
Yeah.
those inferences would go down the tubes, along with a lot of scientific inferences that we've never asked ourselves the question, like in continental drift theory and things like that, whether if they were untrue, whether life could exist. So like
Yeah, actually,
atomic theory,
I think I've heard people say that you couldn't have gotten humans unless you would have the continents been split apart. Right? So maybe
right?
if you took this seriously, then you might you might have to start denying continental drift.
And
Um,
a lot of other theories, like atomic theory, like so you're reasoning if atoms didn't exist, they wouldn't have this big coincidence. Well, yeah, you would, um, because or so anyhow you could there's an observer dependence there. You have to work those probabilities out, but I don't think it's going to work very well.
yeah. An example I like to give is by this logic, your existence gives you no evidence that your parents didn't use effective contraception.
Right.
Because oh, if they had, then you wouldn't have existed, and so all the times that you exist,
I think
you
that's a good
make the same
simple argument.
observations, right? But it's like you're likelier to exist. They didn't use effective contraception. Okay.
But the big thing here is he would need to he would need to go a lot deeper. This is very superficial. It doesn't even recognize the debate here and how much Sober is actually in the minority about this.
Yeah. Sober's in with a very substantial minority on this one, and I think this objection very clearly doesn't work. But okay, so
But the
I mean,
philosophers just give bad arguments anyhow. They don't know how to give good arguments. So why bother citing the literature on this anyhow?
right. Well, the only thing worth citing is Richard Carrier's other blog posts. That's sort of where all the world's wisdom lies. Okay, so we can just maybe finish by just explaining where he goes wrong mathematically. So he says probability of there not being fine tuning given naturalism and the observation is 0. Right. Okay. Right. Given natural, I mean that's not quite right because there could be a naturalistic world in which didn't need fine tuning, but
So, well,
close
we're
enough.
right here. Okay, equals the fine tuning, not fine tuning given naturalism plus or it's very close to 0 because if you exist, there'd have to be fine tuning. Yeah, but
Right. But here he's just building in the observation. But the point is, the
right.
odds of you being around to make the observation are vastly higher given atheism than theism. So even if you think you making the observation is that of the worlds where you make an observation of any sort, a
Right.
larger portion of the naturalistic ones have your experiences than of the theistic ones. That's just completely irrelevant because
Right.
what matters is the share of the worlds where you would make this observation on naturalism and of theism,
Right.
not the portion of the worlds that contain you making at least one observation. Right. I mean, so it's just
Well,
completely wrong probabilistically.
I would only say that there is, Sober does defend, and he's got like what Jonathan Weisberg has given a good response that you always should include observation in your background information. So that's his objection to the fine tuning. So he's tried to work out this objection, but that has a lot of problems with it. In just common cases, you should do that.
Right, but
And
certainly Carrier's attempted mathematical demonstration of this doesn't
yeah,
work. It'll hinge on more substantive issues. And I think Carrier's view just requires putting evidentially relevant things in the background. But
right.
like
Oh,
you
that
shouldn't do
should be
that.
subtractive.
If
Yeah,
something
you
right,
can
if
always,
something's likely on one theory, then you don't get to just sweep it under the rug by placing it in the background.
so you should be subtracting out your, as best as you can, your evidence from the background. Because otherwise, if you don't do that, then that's the problem of old evidence. If you don't subtract it out, which is a common Bayesian issue, and for subjective Bayesianism, if you don't subtract it out, then like anytime you have old evidence, like when Einstein developed his theory of general relativity, the precession of Bertillon and Mercury was known. So by the time people were evaluating whether that was evidence for his theory or not, it was already in the background information. Um,
Yeah.
and but most people argue, no, it's still counted as evidence because you're supposed to subtract that out. So
Yeah.
after the fact, if once you know the evidence, then it would destroy your inference if you couldn't subtract it out. And
Yeah.
so he has to say why in the case of observation, you shouldn't be subtracting that out.
Yeah. Exactly right. Okay. I mean, I'll probably write a longer response at some point.
Right.
I will say one thing that's just very, very funny. So after reading this post, I challenged Carrier to a debate. And Carrier said he wouldn't do a verbal debate, but he would do a written debate on his blog. So I said, well, I don't want to do a written debate on your blog, but I'll just write a response to you. And so now he's accusing me of ducking a debate. When I said I'm happy to do a verbal debate and I'm going to write a comprehensive response. I don't understand why it being on his blog makes it any different. It's very silly. But
because he has control over it.
Yeah, I mean, it's just completely ridiculous. Yeah. But anyways,
but as far as you know, he might delete this what you said or change what you say on the blog, and no one would know.
I think
his
what he
tribe,
does,
his tribe or his cult members might not know.
Yeah, I think what he does, the format was just every article was just sent out to just every week or something. One of us the next round, and I forget the exact format, but it explicitly would rule out him modifying after the fact things. But yeah, anyways, right. I mean, it's just very silly. And I mean, one epistemological point: if a person seems like they know too much, that is to say, if it seems like they're commenting on lots and lots of different subjects where they don't seem to have any background, and they're claiming that lots and lots of other people are cranks or morons, even people who have much more robust background in the field than they do, probably they're the ones who are confused. It would be very surprising.
Almost certainly they're the ones that are confused.
Yeah, it would be really surprising if Richard Carrier knew more about fine tuning and about history and about and about neuroscience than just all the experts. That would be a deep shock. And I think when you read the things he says, it's quite clear that that's not the case. But okay, anyways, so seems like a good place to wrap up. Thanks for doing this, Robin, and hope being exposed to this lethal dose of Richard Carrier hasn't been too dispiriting.
No, I know there's people out there. Usually I just don't bother with them because I don't waste my time with them. The only reason, and you're not going to convince the people that are already his followers, but you can help people that are in between somewhere. And it's nice to get this, that this response is out anyhow on your blog and your YouTube channel.
Yeah, I agree. All right, thanks for doing this. Thanks for watching, everyone. I guess I'll end the stream now.